This is Geology 100 Natural Disasters. My name is Dr. Scott Nowicki, and this lecture topic is tropical cyclones, otherwise known as hurricanes. All of this information is taken directly from the NOAA, that's the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration website that is linked below. Hurricanes, otherwise known as tropical cyclones, are specific types of storms that form in warm water equatorial regions, but they can move long distances over the Earth. The definition of a hurricane is simply that winds exceed 74 miles per hour. Now the diameters can be pretty variable. Somewhere between 100 and 400 kilometers is normal. They can be bigger, and sometimes they can be a little bit smaller. The heights are 12 to 14 kilometers in height. The main characteristic is that they require this warm water to form, and then they die out as they move over land. All of these hurricanes rotate, and they rotate as a function of the Earth spinning and causing this Coriolis effect. Paths of hurricanes are difficult to predict, but our warning systems are getting better every year. The worst damage from hurricanes occurs from wind and storm surge, but there are a couple of other interesting characteristics that we can talk about. The weather in the tropics is basically hot and humid. This is due to the fact that the Earth is receiving a whole lot more solar radiation in that part of the planet than it re-radiates to space. This excessive heating generates weather that can impact a lot of other locations around the globe. Large amounts of energy that are being input to the equatorial regions that want to flow towards the polar regions that causes a lot of the weather that we know on the planet. The intertropical convergence zone is this equatorial region that sees these northern and these southern winds converging. Fairly often it's a band of clouds that form somewhat near the equator, but that band moves to the north and to the south as a function of the seasons. During northern summer, that ITCZ moves north, and during southern summer, that band moves to the south. A tropical cyclone is a warm core low pressure system that doesn't have any front, like a warm or cold front moving through the United States. It develops over tropical or subtropical waters, so relatively near the equator, and has an organized circulation. There are these big rotating masses of clouds. Depending on the location, they have different names around the world. In the Atlantic and Eastern Pacific, we call them hurricanes. In the Western Pacific, they're called typhoons. And in the Indian Ocean, they are cyclones. There are a number of basins around the world. If you live in the United States, you know of this Atlantic basin. From June to November is when we see the warmest waters and therefore the most energy to go into these storms. And in other locations, especially in south of the equator, it is the opposite. So it is during our winter that the southern hemisphere receives the most energy that can turn into hurricanes. Tropical storm formation is relatively simple. You start with warm, moist air that is being generated by the evaporation of water. That water rises into the atmosphere, and as that water rises, it cools and condenses into effectively clouds or droplets of water. That condensation releases heat into the atmosphere, causing this air to move even quicker upwards, and that warm air continues to rise with moist air from the ocean taking its place, creating more wind. So the winds that we see as these horizontal speeds are actually a function of how much energy is moving up through this atmospheric column. Hurricanes tend to have the same general form and layout. They are relatively wide. They have an eye in the middle of the storm, but are these rotating masses of clouds. So they start at lower latitudes and work their way towards higher latitudes. A storm surge is the oceanic water that is being pulled and pushed along the storm by the force of the winds, way over any infrastructure that has been built around coastal cities. Other hazards associated with hurricanes include large-scale winds, of course, either sustained winds or these squalls, these short-term, high-intensity winds. Inland flooding, whether it's from rainfall or from these storm surges, and sometimes even tornadoes. There are, because of the winds, tornadoes can form and be pretty catastrophic. We use a 1 through 5 scale number in order to categorize hurricanes. And this number corresponds directly to the wind speed. So Category 1 is anything 74 to 95 miles per hour. Category 2, 96 to 110 miles per hour. All the way up to Category 5, anything with speeds greater than 155 miles per hour. Below this 74 mile per hour, it is a tropical storm. Below that, it's a tropical depression. So it makes sense that there is this range of different intensities of storms. Along with this wind speed, the storm surge gets higher as you go to these higher numbers, and the damage, of course, increases as well. We're going to look at a number of different characteristics of hurricanes from different sources of information. This is merely an introduction to get you going.